The Mindful Medic podcast is proudly sponsored by the Medical Benevolent Association of New South Wales, ACT. The MBA is an independent charity that has been supporting doctors in New South Wales and the ACT since 1896. They provide specialised counselling, information, referral and financial assistance to doctors and their families during times of adversity or hardship. Their aim is to provide non-judgmental support so that the doctor or family member recovers their well-being and independence and, wherever possible, returns to their vocation. Their services are free, specialised and no referral is necessary. All contact is kept strictly confidential and they are independent of any regulatory body. Hello and a warm welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Cheryl Martin. Welcome for those who are joining us for the first time, and thanks for coming back to our previous listeners. I took a bit of a hiatus last month due to a busier clinical schedule, but also to reflect on some of the learnings and feedback I've received from the project to date. I also wanted to trial a different recording platform. And importantly, I wanted to read some great books written by a few of the future guests that you will meet in season 2. Very pleasingly for me as an avid reader, this podcast has evolved to feature some of my rather fantastic and inspiring colleagues who also have great skills in writing, and I've been able to share their work in words. So it has been a particular joy to spend some time reading and absorbing. I'm also delighted to say that today's guest was actually introduced to me by my guest in episode 2, Dr. Sheila Vaidya. So it's been really lovely to see that we're opening up and collaborating and sharing a community of people doing some really fantastic things. I've also had some other colleagues contact me, telling me a bit about their work, and I'm looking forward to introducing them in future episodes too. So the title of this podcast has attracted a little bit of controversy. I think many people think I can't spell. We've talked a bit about the word mindful, so one word, one L, and the idea that it means to pay attention on purpose without judgment in the present moment. Some of the words of one of the fathers of mindfulness, Dr Dzung. And really, when you're being mindful, you're shutting out a lot of the noise. And the reality is that most of us live in our busy minds. And the mindful, so 2 words, 2 L's, really reflects how I personally feel most of the time, and I'm sure most people listening can identify with that. But we are going to focus on the topic of mindfulness today. And, I think there are quite a few misconceptions. There is this feeling that, you do have to be sitting down, meditating, clearing your mind of all your thoughts, which, personally I find very challenging. And I'm delighted that today's guest has a very practical approach, and he's not only introducing that to his patients, but this is based on a solid grounding in his own personal practice, which he also shares with his colleagues. And I think today's conversation was never more pertinent. As we go to air to date stamp this episode, the world remains in a state of flux as the COVID-19 global pandemic continues to wreak havoc, and ripples of first and second waves of community transmission of infection have recently affected us both locally here in Australia and continue to impact around the world. And in the midst of this, we quite rightly have heightened concern for our mental health and what some have praised to be the next pandemic or crisis in our healthcare system. And I'm definitely seeing this in my colleagues, my friends, my family, and in my patients. And today we're going to focus on young adults. Adolescence is a critical time of growth, physical, mental, and emotional development. And today's young adults face challenges like never before. They currently have restrictions on their social interactions, their studies are disrupted. Social media has, a pervasive role, and there's so much uncertainty about the future. If there's any group where embedding tools and skills to help, ability to manage ourselves and our circumstances in the face of constant flux and challenge, then arguably young adulthood is a particularly critical time.
I think adolescence is such an amazing time in life. There's such potential. What happens in adolescence can really set the course for lifelong health into adulthood. So adolescence is when people develop their identities, figure out who they are. They develop coping skills, learn how to handle stress, learn how to handle difficult emotions. So tremendous opportunity, because the habits they develop at that time can really set the stage for lifelong wellness and well-being.
It is my very great pleasure to introduce Dr Dzung Vo to the podcast. Dr Dzung is a paediatrician specialising in adolescent medicine, and he's also the director of the BC Children's Hospital Centre for Mindfulness. In partnership with his colleague Dr Jake Locke, Dr Vo has co-developed the MARS-A, so Mindful Awareness and Resilience Skills for Adolescence programme, which is an 8-week mindfulness training program for adolescents with depressive symptoms, with or without other co-occurring chronic illness or chronic pain. He's also developed a mindful healing course for health practitioners, which has been adapted from Ron Epstein and Michael Krasner's Mindful Practice and other sources. He is also the author of, I think, a fantastic book, The Mindful Teen, which, having read a few times now, would highly recommend to not only clinicians and teenagers, but to parents, to teachers, and indeed to everyone. I think it's a very accessible text and really a very practical guide. In this conversation, we discuss the book and we talk about Dr. Dzung's valuable work, not only in Vancouver, but how he is sharing this with a wider global community. Enjoy this episode. But I'd like to start, so thanking you for giving up your time, but also, I think you are in quite a niche area, even within pediatrics in medicine, a time of critical development, physically, mentally, emotionally, adolescence. So I'm curious to know what attracted you to this particular specialization.
I think adolescence is such an amazing time in life. There's such potential. What happens in adolescence can really set the course for lifelong health into adulthood. So adolescence is when people develop their identities, figure out who they are. They develop coping skills, learn how to handle stress, learn how to handle difficult emotions. So tremendous opportunity, because the habits they develop at that time can really set the stage for lifelong wellness and well-being. On the other hand, it's also an opportunity, it's also a danger area where if they develop unhealthy coping mechanisms, or they have traumas or other major stressors, that can also set the path towards lifelong chronic illness, mental and physical illness. So I think it's a really tremendous opportunity. And the other thing is, I just love working with teenagers. I think they're fantastic and a lot of fun.
And did you know that quite early on in your career, or was that something that it transpired organically through your training?
Yeah, I actually wanted to work with adolescents before I decided to go into medicine. I wanted to work with young people in some capacity. So if I wasn't a doctor, maybe I would be a youth worker or a social worker or a teacher or a therapist. But I've always wanted to work with young people, absolutely.
Have you any idea why that is? Anything?
Yeah, I think a lot of it had to do with my own adolescence, to be totally honest. I definitely went through some of my own struggles during adolescence. I also had some really important adults in my adolescence, including my family and people outside of my family, some key adults who really helped me get through those hard times and helped me learn who I am and helped me learn some strategies and skills, including things like mindfulness,
Yeah.
that have helped me to become the person I am and be as healthy as I can be. And I wanted to be a part of that and have that opportunity to connect with other young people in that way.
So you talk a wee bit about this in the introduction to the book, a bit about your own discovery of the practice of mindfulness and how it impacted you personally. Do you mind, I mean, I know there's various definitions. Do you mind talking a bit about a definition of mindfulness and what it meant for you personally and how your own practice developed?
Well, mindfulness is one of those things that can't really be defined in words. It's kind of like asking, what does chocolate taste like, or what does music sound like? You really have to experience it. But we can try, and definitions can at least give you a starting point. So I like John Kabat-Zinn's definition. He says mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and without judgment. And I modify that just a little bit. I say it's about paying attention on purpose, in the present moment, and with unconditional love. And I add on that last piece because for me, mindfulness has an inherent element of compassion and kindness. It's not only paying attention, but it's paying attention with an open-hearted, caring attitude. And that combination is really what makes mindfulness have its power to be healing and transformative in my experience.
So how did you discover the practice yourself?
I came into it growing up. So, as you probably know, mindfulness is nothing new. It's been around for thousands of years. It goes back to traditions in Asia like Buddhism and Hinduism. And there are things like mindfulness, maybe not using that exact word, but things like that in wisdom traditions throughout the world. So, it is, I think, a universal human capacity that many cultures have developed a way to cultivate. And in my particular case, I came through it through Buddhism because my family is Vietnamese American and Buddhist. And my father in particular grew up in that tradition. He introduced it to me. And it's not to say that I was doing mindfulness and meditation when I was, 15 years old. That's not the case. But I had those seeds planted and watered in me. And then before I started medical school, when I was 22 years old, I had finished my undergraduate degree. That's when I had my first real immersion into mindfulness through the Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, who is a Vietnamese Zen master, and my father had introduced me to him. So I went on a retreat with Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh in France just before I started medical school. And for me, it was a really life-changing, transformative experience because it really taught me that mindfulness is a way of living. It's a concrete tool that I could apply in my life. It's not just a nice idea. It's not just a philosophy, but it's a way of being in the world. And that's really laid the foundation for the kind of person I want to try to become, as well as the kind of physician I try to be every day.
So at what point did you formalize that into a course and obviously now a book for your patients and thought, well, how can I bring this to my young adults?
Yeah, that took a long time, and the first few years of my exploration in mindfulness was really solidifying and developing my own personal practice in my own personal life first. And that was a number of years where mindfulness helped me to survive the rigors and stresses of medical school and medical training. And after several years of that, I started to think about how I could use it in my clinical practice with teenagers in my fellowship training in adolescent medicine. I was at the University of California, San Francisco at the time, and I was seeing a lot of teenagers who experienced stress-related conditions. Maybe that it was depression, maybe it was anxiety, maybe it was eating disorders, maybe it was substance use disorders, maybe it was chronic pain. All of these have a common element of stress, either causing or contributing to these illnesses. And by this time, I had really experienced how mindfulness could help me so much. So I started to wonder, could I offer mindfulness in some way to the adolescents I'm working with? Around the same time, I took a mindfulness-based stress reduction course as a participant, MBSR, which was developed by John Kabat-Zinn. And that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me because the practice was very similar to what I had been practicing in the Thich Nhat Hanh community, but it was made much more secular, scientific, and really framed around health. And so that opened the door to me seeing how mindfulness and healthcare and medicine could really come together. But at the time, there was really very few people teaching mindfulness to adolescents in that kind of setting. So I started to partner with a handful of people that I was lucky enough to meet and develop some mindfulness training programs for adolescents at BC Children's Hospital when I arrived around 2010, 2011. And it's been quite a journey since then.
That's quite interesting. I probably discovered my mindfulness practice about the same age, more through my yoga practice when I was a medical student. Didn't really call it mindfulness, didn't really know, and that's why I particularly identify with section 2 of the book, which talks about different ways you can approach mindfulness, mindful movement, mindful breathing. And I mean, now I think as an undergraduate here in Australia, mindfulness is part of the core curriculum. Did you come up against how did you recruit your colleagues? Were they very open to it when you started to formalize the sessions for the patients?
I have to say I feel very lucky because I had a lot of support and collegiality from the beginning of when I really started to dive into this. I would have to credit Dr. Jake Locke, who is a child and adolescent psychiatrist at BC Children's Hospital, and his long experience with things like mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So when I arrived at BC Children's Hospital, he was one of the first people I met with. And so we developed a really strong partnership and created our course, Mindful Awareness and Resilience Skills for Adolescents, fairly quickly. And then within my hospital and in the broader community, it's been generally very supportive as well. I think part of it is because the healthcare providers that we're working with, they see that teenagers are stressed out, and they see that a lot of the tools that we have in Western medicine are limited. Pharmacologics, like medications, as well as some psychological therapies, they're limited to some degree, and there's a need for other approaches and other ways. And I think my colleagues really see this. I also think that in Vancouver, British Columbia, I think the culture is open to these types of approaches as well. So I have to say I felt very lucky that I've been able to get it off the ground and running without much resistance. I know it's not like that everywhere. It really depends on your setting, your healthcare setting, maybe the city or region that you live in. But I've been very lucky.
You've done a lot of hard work to bring that to everyone. I wanted to just dive into a wee bit some of the sections, particularly within the book, just to give people a bit of a taste for when they go and download. I particularly like section 2, where it does talk about different approaches to mindfulness. That I think if you don't have experience of mindfulness, you might have a quite generic a view of what it actually entails. So we've talked about the mindful walking, breathing, eating. Do you have your own particular favorite techniques, and do you find that this gives your teenagers something that they can latch onto? Are they surprised that eating can be mindful, for example?
Yeah, I agree with you. There is a stereotype that mindfulness is just like sitting still with your eyes closed and looking like a monk. And, that is one way to be mindful, but it's certainly not the only way. And for me personally, walking meditation is the mindfulness practice that I gravitate towards the most, that I find most enjoyable. But everyone is going to be different. When I work with teenagers, one of the things I often ask them is, what's something that you already do, or some experience that you've had in your life where you felt naturally mindful, where you were really present, you were enjoying every moment, you weren't worried about the future, you weren't worried about the past, you weren't judging yourself, you weren't judging anyone else. And most teenagers have had some experience like that, whether it's in sports or music or art or with their friends. And what I tell them is that mindfulness is a natural human capacity that we all have, and that the mindfulness practices that we can offer, these meditations, whether formal meditation or informal, these are really just ways of training and cultivating that strength that you already have. And then in our course, we offer many different mindfulness practices: sitting, walking, body scan, eating, movements, mindful listening. And I basically offer it as a menu. And I say, I just invite you to try all of these with an open mind, treat it like an experiment, not assuming that you know what it's going to be like. And then by the end of the 8 weeks, hopefully you've experienced something that you find useful. And it may not be the same thing that I find useful or that the next person finds useful, but hopefully you found something that's useful and you can make mindfulness practice your own. And usually by the end of the 8 weeks, most of the teenagers have started to invent their own mindfulness practices. They've invented their own ways of being mindful, because it's not about looking a certain way, following a certain recipe. It's really just about embodying that wholehearted, kind, loving presence that we talked about.
And I think that's what makes it so accessible. I listened to the audiobook version, and I really enjoyed listening to the teen voices section. I think it really does, bring the adolescent voice to your own book. Have you got any favourite stories from the book? Any particularly skeptical teenagers that you might want to share?
I definitely remember one young person I worked with. I knew her through a local community center where I used to do drop-in mindfulness courses. And this was in an urban area of Vancouver with disproportionately affected by things like poverty. People really overcame a lot of difficulties in that area. And I ran a monthly drop-in mindfulness group. I knew her from the community center, so I would usually kind of bring her into the group, but she wasn't really wanting to go. I was able to kind of drag her in because we had the kind of relationship where we could do that. But I noticed that most of the time she was sitting in the back, she was sitting next to her sister, she would be on her phone, she would be giggling. And I kind of didn't think that she was really getting anything out of it. And this happened for probably 4 or 5 months. And then one day I came into the center and I saw her. She looked like she had been waiting for me. And as soon as she saw me, she said, "Hey, Dr. Dzung, I had something I really want to tell you." And I said, "Okay, what happened?" She said, "Well, I had to do a medical procedure and I started to get really nervous. I started to freak out. And then the technician said, if you don't calm down, we're going to have to cancel the procedure." And she said, "Oh, well, that made me freak out even more because I didn't want to cancel it. I knew that I just have to come back and do it again." So I said, "Wait a minute, don't cancel it. Let me do this thing that Dr. Dzung taught me." And the technician said, "Okay, do what you need to do. I don't know what Dr. Dzung is, but go ahead and do what you need." And so she said, "I closed my eyes and then I imagined hearing your voice talking about that breathing thing that you do in that class." And I just did that for a few minutes. And by the time I opened my eyes, we were done. The procedure was done. And for me, that was a really amazing story. First of all, it taught her that she had this power that she didn't know she had, but that she could tap into when she needed to. And for me, it really taught me a lesson not to assume anything, not to assume that a young person is, quote unquote, getting it or not getting it, but really to see my job as planting seeds, just showing up as authentically as I can, teaching from my own practice, my own life experience, teaching from the heart. And having some confidence that some seeds are being watered. And with teenagers, we water the seeds, but we don't know exactly when and how the seeds are going to sprout and how the flowers are going to come up. But if we're watering the seeds with authenticity and integrity, I think we can have some confidence that they'll come up in some way when we need them to. And I've seen that over and over in my practice, not just in mindfulness, but in other areas as well. That's one of the real joys of working with adolescents, and it certainly comes through in mindfulness too.
Yeah, I think that is just so powerful and never more relevant than in the current very challenging place that we find ourselves in the world, with so much change, so much uncertainty, and so much that we can't control. I remember when I was doing my first teacher training as part of my yoga journey, quite a few of my fellow teacher trainees were teachers themselves. I know when we did our mindfulness sessions, and many of them said they were bringing these learnings back to their classrooms, and particularly felt their adolescent patients were crying out for it. I wonder, has the way that you are working with your patients and interacting with young adults changed, particularly at the moment? Any particular tools or techniques or things that you're advising and encouraging when working with them?
Yeah, I think first of all, I think it's important that we just acknowledge that it's a hard time right now. It's a hard time growing up in general during this time period with the stresses and challenges that so many young people face, especially the challenges that marginalized kids who are discriminated against face, racism, violence, social determinants of health, and then of course the pandemic as well. So I think just being present with that is the first thing. And then I think the second thing is some self-compassion. And I've really integrated a lot more self-compassion into my mindfulness training. It's always been a part of mindfulness, but I'm emphasizing it more right now because I think that's where we have to start. And self-compassion means just recognizing it's hard, recognizing it hurts, and then taking care of that pain and holding ourselves with some kindness, treating ourselves as we would a good friend. So self-compassion, and then the other thing is connection. So connecting with other people, not trying to face this alone. The pandemic is already isolating, and we need to find other ways of connecting with each other. So I think those are really important. Sleep certainly is really important as well. Mindfulness can sometimes help with sleep too, especially things like the body scan. And then exercise, nutrition, all of those basics are super, super important.
And I feel very strongly it's important for us to have these important self care and calibration tools ourselves and mindfulness practice. Do you run courses for your colleagues at BC?
Yeah, we do. So I've been able to develop something called the BC Children's Hospital Center for Mindfulness, and that is a really a community of mindfulness practitioners throughout our hospital. And our missions are to bring mindfulness, number one, to children and families, number two, to parents and caregivers, and then number three, to the professionals themselves, because we need it first and foremost to be the best healthcare providers we can be. And also, if we want to offer mindfulness to other people, we have to embody it and practice it ourselves. So I've been offering a course called Mindful Healing to health professionals at my hospital. And it's a modification of the work by Ron Epstein and Mick Krasner at the University of Rochester. They call it mindful practice. And it's a really fantastic way of bringing mindfulness to healthcare professionals, really focusing on the issues that we as healthcare professionals face. So things like burnout, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma, grief and loss, medical errors, communication and conflict, teamwork, decision making. And it's been a lot of fun, very rewarding, very successful. Just the other day, I got an email from one of my surgery colleagues, and he wants to bring mindfulness to the surgery residents at our hospital, which I think is fantastic. So we've had a lot of openness to it at my hospital and around the province as well. And so I feel like it's part of a larger community, nationwide, internationally. It is a movement, because I agree with you, as healthcare providers, we need it, especially during the pandemic, just as much as anyone else, if not more so.
And I think we're more likely then to share that with others, with our colleagues, with our patients, with our families. It's like you say, it's like an epidemic of kindness, compassion. Where would you like to see, all of the great work that you're doing go in the future? Have you any other plans? It sounds like there's already quite a few plans to extend it.
Yeah, if I was successful beyond my wildest dreams, we would have mindfulness embedded into everything that we do at my workplace, number one. So at my hospital and at my university, we would just have a mindful culture, and that everything in the hospital is infused with mindfulness. So all the staff, and then we would offer it to patients and to children and families in creative ways, in different units, different settings, depending on what their needs are. So that's my ultimate vision. And then the way we get there is through one step at a time, one program at a time, one partnership at a time, and really building community, because mindfulness is not something that can be done alone. It's not a solo sport. It's a team sport. It's a community practice. And so there's a real joy in building mindful community together as well.
I'm very conscious with all the work that you're doing, and it's even more important to have or maintain your own personal practice at this time. Can you tell me, because we all struggle at times, and do you have any go-to practices that you harness when you're aware that, you're giving a lot of yourself and things are so uncertain? What are your favorite?
I'll share three things. Number one, I do a lot of walking and movement meditation, and I try to spend as much time outdoors as I can. And luckily in Vancouver in the summer, it's very easy to do that. Number two, I try to build community, so I'm not practicing alone. And so I make a point to practice mindfulness with my family and with friends and other practitioners once a week or several times a week if I can. So that way we're supporting each other, we're learning from each other. And then number three, I think this has been a real challenge recently. It's always been a challenge for me, but especially recently, is what I would call mindful consumption and of news media. And what I mean by this is paying attention to what's coming in social media and news media enough that I'm informed, that I can make healthy decisions for myself, that I can be involved in things like advocacy to help make the world a better place for teenagers and for other people, but not so much that I'm consuming media in a way that just makes me feel drained, feel tired or exhausted, because at that point it's not doing any good. So finding that balance, and really what it means for me is actually limiting the amounts of media consumption I do, so that way I can stay healthy and energized, but also informed.
Oh, listen, I think you're doing some really fantastic work. And I know that I have colleagues here, starting to do similar things. And I think that will only encourage them. But I mean, in the meantime, the book, in terms of just how I certainly myself find it easy to digest, and I've had some feedback from young people that have also found it, very accessible, not what they were expecting. And I really appreciate you for putting all that work in and putting it out there, because I think you are already, you're starting, we'll say, a global pandemic of, compassion, as you say, and mindful awareness. This should be something that we do, like cleaning our teeth, that should be part of who we are.
Yeah, agreed.
Really, thank you. I hope that I get to meet you in person one day and not via
Yeah,
Zoom. I'm
yeah.
definitely,
Maybe once things are settled down in the world, we'll be
yeah.
able to build a global community in person. That's always the
I did
best.
my medical elective up the East Coast, so I've been the whole East Coast of Canada. I definitely want to make it over, and I've got to visit Shayla at one point as well, so I'll maybe do both. So.
Yeah, please do. It's lovely.
Finally, where can we find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so two websites that you can check out. One is my own personal website, which is mindfulnessforteens.com. The second website has a lot of information on mindfulness for teenagers, and it's on the Kelty Mental Health Resource Center. And the best way to find that is just Google Kelty with a K and mindfulness. And then the Kelty, yeah, Kelty, and mindfulness. So the Kelty Mental Health Resource Center is associated with BC Children's Hospital. And then the third is bcchildrens.ca/mindfulness. And that will take you to the BC Children's Hospital Center for Mindfulness. It's still a very new project, and so we're still developing and growing it, but we have big visions and big hopes for that project.
You have just been listening to the wisdom of Dr. Dzung Vo. So I'll put a link in the show notes to where you can access the book and some of the other resources that we have discussed here. I'm also going to note down some really useful resources here in Australia. Some very important work by Professor Craig Hassad and his colleague Dr Richard Chambers at Monash University in Victoria. And I've personally done their online mindfulness course and recommend. Also encourage you to download the Smiling Mind app, which I personally find useful too. But I do encourage Dr. Dzung's book, particularly to teenagers and young adults, and indeed to their parents, teachers, and to my colleagues. I think it's a very accessible and practical guide, really demystifying, and I really think there's something in there for everyone, and it would encourage a read. I also just want to finish by, I think it's so important to emphasize what Dr. Dzung has already said, that to acknowledge that this is a very challenging time and to hold space for that. I want to finish with, a quote that I find really summarizes mindfulness. And it was introduced to me by my yoga instructor, Dominique Salerno, who I hope to have on the show in a future episode. And the quote is by Pema Chodron. And she says that you are the sky, everything else is just the weather. I just want to leave you with that today. And I hope you found something valuable in today's episode. So wherever you are, stay safe, stay well, and I look forward to joining you next time.
Yeah, I mean, if I was successful beyond my wildest dreams, we would have mindfulness embedded into everything that we do at my workplace, number one. So at my hospital and at my university, we would just have a mindful culture, and that everything in the hospital is infused with mindfulness. So all the staff, and then we would offer it to patients and to children and families in creative ways, in different units, different settings, depending on what their needs are.
The MBA New South Wales ACT does wonderful work for those of our colleagues who are, at this very minute, experiencing a hard time. One way you can show you care about doctors' welfare is to go to their website, www.mbamsw.org.au, and donate today. Knowing that their colleagues' care is a big part of these doctors' recovery, so please be part of the solution. All donations are tax deductible. If you can, please consider a monthly donation, as even small amounts collectively will allow them to plan their growth to support the increased demand.